Hi there, my name is Simon Moffett, founder and research analyst at the Cyber Hut. In this video, I want to discuss the evolution of privileged access management and why we need to consider improving our mean time to access to a range of high privilege and high risk systems. We need to understand that privileged access management, PAM, it is evolving and it needs to evolve into a different function than it was perhaps 2 decades ago. I think it's important to consider the breadth and depth of privileged integration and integration against high-risk systems has been increasing for the past 5, 8, 9 years, and we are seeing a set of changes occurring. First of all, there's a considerable increase in the number of systems requiring PAM or privileged access capabilities. We have more identities, we have more accounts, which by design means we have a higher risk or more risk that needs to be both managed and mitigated against. And a decade ago, 15 years ago, your commercial PAM systems were very much on premises, very much targeting a subset of core infrastructure, Linux servers, databases, core infrastructure components. And obviously, as a result of that, we had a smaller subset of users and accounts accessing them, typically infrastructure administration teams and other, using a quite restrictive set of access methods, command line interfaces, secure shell, etc. It was a much easier thing to visualize from a risk perspective. But of course, over time, we then start to involve outsourced infrastructure, the sort of evolution to more of a cloud service provider view of being able to deliver networking, compute, data storage, processing, and other. So we started to see this evolution to more of a hybrid world where we'd still have on-premises capabilities, Kubernetes or cloud native, virtualization, and other. Also integration into that CSP world, and we start to see the introduction of DevOps in there as well. So the obviously the more an automated way of delivering and building software and services and sort of API-led economy there, all looking to optimize our CI/CD pipelines. And of course, all of those individual components essentially have high risk associated with them. But I guess the final stage, as we are leveraging both cloud, hybrid, developer-centric capabilities as well, we have more identities to manage and more systems to manage. So we do start to essentially move towards things like just-in-time access, ephemerality of both permissioning and credentials needed to access those downstream services. So the last decade, we're starting to see privileged access evolve. It's starting to move away from being sort of system-centric and being on-premises to being much more of a access-centric and an identity-centric approach there, where we're not just looking at particular subsets of capabilities and services. We're looking at tying things to the identity. And of course, those identities may not just be human-centric. They could well be non-human related workloads, services, and obviously more latterly, things like agentic AI as well, performing non-deterministic functions against a whole array of different high-risk events and systems. Increase in the number and type of systems and the breadth of systems being integrated really mean we need to sort of think a little bit around what we're actually securing. And I think over the past maybe 2 to 4 years, we've seen this concept of the production stack. We need to start asking the question really of what really is needed to run a particular business or a department or a function or an application or a go-to-market system or service. We need to break that down into absolutely the core infrastructure. So the computation power, the storage, networking, even if that's sort of software-defined networking and other. But then underneath that, we're going to have a whole host of services and capabilities which are needed to deliver whatever that business function happens to be, online service, a website, application, a mobile system, and other. So you start to build a hierarchy of systems and services there, which really is this production stack, which is allowing the business to function and operate as a business. And by design, that's going to have a much broader variety of systems and services. And of course, those systems and services are going to be accessed by a broader array of protocols, access locations, desktops, on-prem, the zero trust narrative there, so everything's available to all different locations. But of course, a whole host of non-human identity functions in there as well. And I think what is interesting is we're starting to see a broader array of stakeholders required to support this production stack. So not just core infrastructure administrators, but developers, engineers, the supporting functions to allow development to take place. That's DevOps, CI/CD, security operations in there as well. So we start to have a much broader array of stakeholders involved in accessing this production stack, which in turn means we need to start thinking about how we can deliver a more identity-centric approach to production access and privileged systems. That introduces a whole host of things. Absolutely, we need to start thinking about the broader array of integration capabilities. So we're not just fixing and focusing on things like secure shell and specific command line interaction. You need to have a much broader API-led way of integrating systems and services. And again, if we think about things like cloud service provider technologies, a lot of the management and control plane interfaces there are going to be things like command line, they're going to be API first, they're going to have a whole host of different ways of accessing those interfaces remotely. And that essentially introduces a whole different approach to how we think about risk. So on the left-hand side, it's quite a well-known sort of phenomenon to have this sort of degradation in assurance associated with things like strong authentication events, checking out of credentials, all of the sort of access management provisioning relationships that over time, the longer an event takes place, the lower the level of assurance, which is it's a difficult thing to manage, but it's ended up being quite a well-known design pattern. So 2, 3, 4 hours after a session has been issued, clearly we have to start to look at things like step-up authentication. If we're looking at the sort of privileged credential issuance and rotation perspective, again, you want to be having short-lived relations between a high-risk credential and an identity, and looking to shorten and collapse the gaps between some of those big high assurance events, because over time, of course, the assurance starts to degrade. What ideally we're starting to see, though, is a much more dynamic approach to this risk management journey, essentially looking at more of a smart way of thinking about risk, about being able to identify high risk, and in turn being able to respond, make changes, and adjust the risk response there. So the diagram on the right ultimately is looking at essentially having a strategically higher level of assurance, lowering the privileged attack surface, increasing assurance around ephemerality of credentials, ephemerality of access being associated with an account and an identity. Clearly, things like strong auth, absolutely essential ultimately, but also a whole host of secondary functions in there as well around monitoring and auditing, about being able to monitor behaviors and being able to identify something of high risk and then being able to respond and intercept, disrupt, and other. So essentially allowing the assurance to be continually elevated there. And again, this is looking at the entire access journey here. So we're not just talking about upon entry into a high risk system or a privileged system. We're looking at all of the interactions that an account or an identity will then perform within that privileged system. And that's quite a subtly different thing. It sort of moves back down to that traditional aspect of we'd have a very strong authentication event, but then we don't then do anything else until the session has ended. Whereas obviously we're sort of moving to more of a micro and nano event driven privileged world here, where we're looking to issue ephemeral credentials, issue ephemeral access, and then once the access is being used, we're looking at monitoring, we're looking at behavior, we're looking at perhaps even pulling in threat intelligence information as well to allow us to essentially keep the assurance higher, the risk lower over that entire access journey. And of course, we need to be doing this for all of those different systems I mentioned across a whole host of different protocols as well. And obviously that is and has been a key part of the sort of privileged access mandate for the best part of a decade or so or more, which is improving. And this is a real key part of this evolution within privileged access. But there's also a secondary component to this, and this really has to do with the different stakeholders now involved in this modern privileged journey. If we are talking about securing the production stack, we are going to be talking about different systems, different protocols, different locations, a more identity-aware approach to privilege. But by design, that means we have a different set of stakeholders to manage. Absolutely, we are still looking at infrastructure administration and the core team that is responsible for spinning up servers, spinning up compute power, serverless functions, data, and all of the sort of software-defined networking and other. But also teams that are building things. So engineering, coders, the DevOps support model, CI/CD pipeline world that is effectively allowing organizations to build services, go to market, be agile, and other. So this production stack view is essentially much more in line with what the business is trying to achieve. And obviously the incentives for developers and engineering is that they want to create and ship new applications and services accurately, rapidly, in response to business need. And again, a lot of that ties into really strategic business objectives around being first to market, responding to competitive pressures, or other. So it's much more in tune with what the business is trying to achieve. So you want to deliver and build services rapidly. You want to be able to respond to bugs, respond to requests of enhancement, respond to threat intelligence, change and patch and update systems accordingly. But obviously, from an engineering perspective, you want to be identifying repeatability. You want to be automating. You want to be looking at the creation of reusable components and other. You don't want to be building access control systems or token checkout and vaulting systems for every single application that you build. You want to be leveraging external platforms. You want to be leveraging economies of scale and having specialist platforms that allow you to focus upon what you are incentivized to do, which is, of course, create software, build software, ship services in an accurate and agile way. And again, very similar sort of incentives for the administration function, that they're very much focused upon the rapid and accurate provisioning of infrastructure and services. And again, the quicker that can be done in a repeatable and reusable fashion, you allow the business to deliver more, be more productive, and allow the business to deliver what they want to deliver. So it's not just a case of looking at risk, albeit clearly that is a big part of it, but we also need to think about that productivity aspect. And I think now, if we are considering a broader array of production systems, the stakeholders involved in there, that they can be inhibited and be restricted by poor privileged access management workflows, poor privileged access request functions, associations with credentials, associations with the correct permissions and other. So we need to start essentially optimizing and allowing these different stakeholders to gain access to those privileged systems in a much more streamlined and faster way to essentially get the privilege function out of their, there wouldn't be a barrier or an inhibitor to allowing them to build services, ship services and other. And this is where we start to accelerate and see the importance of this productivity angle. Identity productivity is not a new concept. I think if we go back sort of 20 years, single sign-on, onboarding services and other, they're all sort of sold, if you like, under the umbrella of improving employee productivity, allowing a member of staff to gain access to a particular downstream system as smoothly and as quickly as possible. Because if they were inhibited gaining access to a system they need to do their job, by design, they aren't being productive. There's a tangible cost there, which can be identified. And when we focus on the production stack, that mean time to access suddenly becomes a cascading problem, because on a twofold level. One is if the engineer or the development team or the infrastructure team cannot gain access to those core systems, not only is that a productivity inhibitor for them, but obviously there is a delay on being able to ship and deliver infrastructure, applications, and services to the business as well. So we really need to think about this mean time to access and being able to collapse that gap between sort of point one and point two and leverage more streamlined ways of accessing those downstream systems, improving the access request functions through recommendations, through past behaviors, through other team members and peer analysis, being able to rapidly approve requests or integration with sort of chat ops world there, whether it's Slack or other, and being able to engage the correct approvals at the right time, perhaps even leveraging things like auto approval and maybe AI in that world where we can amplify and handle common approval workflows automatically and only introducing human in the loop during the most exceptional approval processes. And of course, ultimately trying to move to things like just-in-time access, zero standing privileges, zero standing credentials, and allowing the access to be much more dynamically associated with context, with the identity, with behavior, and allowing us to try and move to something called sort of zero touch access. And this is where the likes of P0 really have quite an interesting approach here, because we're not only just improving the sort of coverage of the privileged access management capabilities, moving away from purely cloud and vault-centric. Not only are we looking at then sort of spreading those capabilities outwards to cloud, to SaaS, to cloud service providers through that API-based approach. The likes of P0 are really starting to then think about this zero-touch aspect. So you're removing the barriers to high privileged access. You're having a consistent policy there, which is covering a multitude of protocols, a multitude of different downstream systems. And the benefit is absolutely your risk profile becomes more acutely in tune with the risk appetite of the business. It's more dynamic or more responsive. But I think as well, that productivity angle, improving engineering and developer access, that is a tangible thing, and it allows the engineering and development function to be essentially working on what they are incentivized to work upon, which is building services rapidly, using repeatability, and allowing the privilege access sort of barriers and gateways to become more visible, more transparent, more automatic, and be much more in line with what the engineering function is trying to achieve versus the risk appetite and the risk management processes that are in place there as well. In summary, PAM is and will continue to evolve. We are certainly seeing this movement to both a hybrid and pure cloud landscape, where we do need to move away from specific vault-centric and isolated ways of handling privileged access, strategically trying to migrate towards just-in-time access, zero standing privileges, zero standing credentials, moving away from hard-coded credentials and static secrets and other in GitHub repositories and the like. But of course, we have more systems and in turn more risk that needs to be managed, and we have to integrate these privileged access components to a broader array of systems, typically using things like API first and other, to really essentially spread the coverage to more areas. But by design, we also have different stakeholders to help, and they have different measurements of success. And whether that's infrastructure, DevOps, SecOps, engineering, they all operate via incentives. But one thing that is becoming very clear is by improving the mean time to access, you have a tangible way of measuring how successful and how effective the privileged access process is operating, and really essentially removing the barriers to those high-risk systems, and those systems essentially allowing the business to operate in a more effective and agile way. Thank you for watching. The evolution of privileged access management will continue to evolve, I think, over the next 2 to 3 years, and absolutely we need to consider improving our risk coverage and our risk response mechanisms, but we also need to be thinking about how we can improve the mean time to access to a broader array of systems and to a broader array of stakeholders.